Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Anja Scheppers. I'm one of the executive directors of Futurist Coast, who are hosting this webinar. And I'm really, really pleased to have here with me my wonderful colleague, Alex Henry, from our team for information technology, who will share with us his knowledge of how to master the art of effective communication with and through artificial intelligence. Welcome, Alex. First, I also would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all the different lands and countries we live and work on, and pay my respect to Indigenous elders, past, present, and emerging. Alex, do you want to give a short introduction about your background? And so I hand over to you. Thank you.
Okay, so my name is Alex Hendry. I'm a lecturer at Southern Cross University. I historically taught advanced software development, but in the last few years, as AI has become more prevalent, I've moved very heavily into this space. There's a big overlap between programming and AI, given that some of the first AI systems were developed for programmers. So in this talk, I'm going to split it into two parts. The first part is on AI models, that's large language models. And the second part, I'm going to introduce prompt engineering. I'll just move to the next slide. While I mention it, you'll notice that I'm using a website here. And I'll just give you a quick overview of this website before we start the talk, because there's a lot of things to cover and we have a limited amount of time. So you can refer to this website for things we skip over, or if you want a little bit more information. So I'll quickly show you how this works. If you come to AI-workshop IT-SCU edu, you'll find this website. And let me just quickly jump ahead to show you, if you are having a look at one of these pages, you will see I have my points here, which we will be discussing. But underneath here, there will be an expanded points section, which has a lot more detail that you can read if you want to know more about it. And if you still want to know more again, if you come down the bottom here to in-depth explanation, you will see, this is not on every page, but it's on most pages. You will see a large prompt here that you could then run in your AI, and it will explain this concept in much greater detail. So you can refer to this site as a learning tool going forward to understand a little bit more about the concepts I'm going to be speaking about. So let me just jump here. So actually, I've already covered this, understanding AI models and prompt engineering. So why do you need to understand models? The first choice of effectively getting something useful out of AI is choosing the right model. If you run the same prompt across different models, you're going to get vastly different results, because as you'll see, different models have been trained for different purposes. There are also some very big trade-offs. We're talking about quality, speed, cost, and essentially environmental impact. So choosing a large model when you don't need to use a large model, you're going to have a much greater environmental impact, and the speed is going to be massively reduced. So choosing the right model and then writing the right prompt will give you the best result possible, while also using fewer resources. So it is important that you do understand the underlying fundamentals of large language models. You don't need to understand in depth how they work, but you need to understand enough to make the right choice when you are trying to choose a model for the task that you want to complete. So let's talk about what models actually are. You can think of an AI model as a system trained to generate text by learning statistical patterns from massive amounts of data. So models have basically, when they train a model, they have basically consumed all of the publicly available information on the internet, plus a lot more. And we can talk a little bit about that if we have time. They've consumed a massive amount of text data. And there are two training phases. So we have what we call the pre-training, where models are learning language itself, grammar, facts, reasoning patterns, how words relate to each other. And this creates the fundamental capabilities of a model. Then following that, we have post-training, and that's when models learn to be helpful. So it teaches the model to be helpful, but also harmless. They put some guardrails on. There's lots of things they do post-training so that when you ask a model and you have a chat with a model, it produces a meaningful result. Now, first thing that you need to understand is the training scale is enormous. Some of the large models that you hear about, like GPT-5 or the latest Sonnet 4.5 model from Claude, or if you're looking at Google's latest model, they have consumed trillions and trillions of words. So this takes weeks and months, and they need to use a massive amount of resources. So they use GPUs, and they use thousands and thousands of them running continuously. So the training for a large model uses a huge amount of energy. You might have heard when they talk about data centers these days, they're building data centers rapidly around the world. And there's going to be, in the coming years, a big trade-off between, energy supply, where energy is going, because to train these big models, it uses a massive amount of energy. So when you use something like ChatGPT, one thing to understand is ChatGPT is not actually AI. ChatGPT is an interface, and that allows you to communicate with a model. So it allows you to talk to the model, and it displays the model's output to you once you have asked it a question or you're having a chat with it. So that's the basics of what a model is and how they learn. Now, how do they generate text? When we train a model, because it's read so much information, it gets very good at predicting the next most probable word based on context. So if you think of something like this, the capital of France is, it's probably seen that thousands of times when it's scraping the internet or listening to YouTube videos. I mean, they do convert YouTube videos to text so they can consume them in these models. So it knows with a high certainty or a high probability that following the capital of France is, the next word should be Paris. But we have what we call low certainty examples. So the weather today is, what could follow that? Hot, cold, pleasant, humid. That's a low probability example. Many words could follow logically. So there's different probabilities assigned to each option. It knows what the most likely option is, the second most likely, the third most likely, but no single word dominates. There's multiple possibilities there. So this is why you might get different responses to the same prompt, because when high probability options exist, the model selects that high probability option. It's not just randomly selecting text, it's selecting from those probabilities. This is also important to understand because this will lead into things like, why can models hallucinate? Why can they produce incorrect information? They are generating the next most likely word based upon the text that came before that. And there are settings that you can change when you are using models. The one you probably heard of the most might be temperature. And what that does is it makes a model more conservative when it's choosing the next most probable word, or more exploratory. So this has a big impact if you are doing something like creative writing, or maybe if you are doing something like some sort of scientific writing, or for me, programming or something like that, when you don't want it to be very creative, you want it to be more conservative in choosing the next most likely word. So as you become more comfortable using models, have a play around with the temperature settings. And one thing I'm going to talk about when we come to prompt engineering is if you're wondering what you should set these are as you become more comfortable with it, the best thing is to ask AI. You can explain to whatever AI system you're using what you're trying to do and ask it maybe what temperature you should be using for that particular task. So large language models we talked about them predicting the next most likely word, but the way they actually work are with things called tokens. So when it reads text, it breaks the text into words, and then it breaks those words into tokens. So you can see there, like for a common word, like the example I've used here, run, that's one token. But you can see derived words, running, runner, and runs. Each of those is two tokens. This is important as well because, as you'll see later, we're going to talk about things like the context window for chats, and also when you're choosing the right model for your task. They work in tokens, so they'll talk about the context window, how many tokens you can send to a model and how many it can receive. That has a big impact on what model you use, because maybe if you're only working with an email compared to a whole textbook chapter, you have to consider these things when you're choosing what model to use for that particular task. So in English, you can consider one token would be about 0.75 words. So that will give you a rough indication. For other languages, it is a little bit different. If you don't speak English as your first language, or you're using a different language with your AI or your chat, you can ask it. Just say, I'm speaking German or I'm speaking Mandarin or whatever it happens to be, and how many tokens equates to how many words. And we'll come back to tokens when we start talking about context windows. So we have different sized models. So we've got small models and large flagship models. And just to give you an example, if you're using something like Claude here that I have open, and I'll show you another one that I like to use shortly called OpenRouter, there are different size models. So in Claude, for example, it will have a couple of models. Sonnet is its fairly large model. Opus is its big flagship model, and Haiku is its small model. So when we're comparing small models to large models, you'll often hear them talk about parameters, and you can think about parameters as learned connections, like neural pathways in a human brain. So the more parameters a model has, the more nuanced understanding it has, the better reasoning, the higher quality its output. This is very important if you are trying to do something that maybe you're getting some feedback on a paper you're writing, for example, or a textbook chapter, but it's not necessary to use a large model if you're just doing something like writing an email or formatting something that you've already written. When it does come to these models, there are big trade-offs. So when we compare a small model to a large model, the first thing is speed. A large model is going to have a much slower response time. And you've probably noticed that if you have played around with them. If I was to run the same prompt with Sonnet, and then I was to run that prompt with Haiku, Haiku would respond much faster. Because what it's essentially doing is loading this whole model into RAM, and then it's got to sort through this model. And so the larger the model is, the longer that it takes to come up with a response. So a large model, it's going to be much slower. It is more expensive. Now, you might be wondering what I'm talking about if you are just paying a flat fee. For example, with Claude here, I have a subscription to Claude. It costs me, I think, $20 a month. But there are places like OpenRouter here, for example, where you can just pay per token. And just to give you an example of cost, if I was to have a look at all of the models on here, if I have a look at a small model like one of the small llama ones, llama, okay, if I have a look at this small llama model, and we can see 17B, that's its parameters, that's a small model. It's only 13.6 cents for a million input tokens and 68 cents for a million output tokens. Whereas if we were to look at one of the much larger models, like Sonnet that I was just talking about before, you can see it's $3 for a million input tokens and $15 for a million output tokens. So cost is a factor as well, and that's a concern. But one thing that you really have to think about is the energy that it uses. So a large model for the same query will use 50 to 100 times more energy. Now that's because a large model has a much higher energy footprint when it comes to training it. It takes a massive amount of energy to train a large model. We talked about before how they're trained. So you have this huge data center with thousands of servers, thousands of GPUs, and these things are running flat out for months and months and months to train a large model. The energy is enormous. So a small model, it's a lot less, requires a lot less energy to train. But when we actually run the query, as I mentioned before, it has to load this whole model onto a GPU, and then it has to sort through the model, all of the information in there. So it uses a lot, it has a much higher energy footprint or a lot more energy consumption to run that query. So if that's important to you, that's something to think about, because the carbon footprint and the amount of energy that AI is using is very large, and that's not to, you've also got to consider the water that these large data centers use, the fact that the equipment that they're training on, these GPUs might have a lifespan of 3 years. All of that ends up, you've probably heard of the e-waste problem that we have. So it's not just the energy, there's a lot of things that you have to consider. So really consider that when you're deciding on what model you're using. Now, if you do have to use something for complex reasoning, if you're doing detailed analysis, something like that, you are going to be using a larger model. For me, when I'm programming, I am using a larger model. But if you're just doing something simple, writing an email, formatting a document, have a go with a smaller model and see how you go, because it'll be a lot faster and it'll have a much better energy footprint, along with, e-waste, all of that sort of thing. I'm sure a lot of you also now have heard of reasoning models, and you might see this when you run a prompt in a model where you see it thinking. So if you see it saying it's thinking, it's what they call a reasoning model. Now, these reasoning models, they are not really an upgrade. They're just different types of models, and they're better for some things, but not for others. So, hang on one second. So once again, they're even slower than the flagship model, because you have to maybe wait 30 seconds while it thinks. They do cost more again, but once again, they have an even greater environmental footprint, because all of that extended thinking time, plus the cost of it to send you your response and work out your response once it's thought about it, much greater environmental impact. Now, a lot of people think that the reasoning models are just the best, of the brand new ones. They're just better than the normal models, but sometimes they can be worse. So it just depends upon what you're doing. Now, if you're doing advanced mathematics, if you're doing complex coding, like I would use this if I'm writing a program, there's a problem with the code and it has to think about what it is. If you're doing something with scientific reasoning, analysis, all of that sort of things, all those things there, these models really excel. But sometimes for things like, brainstorming creative research questions, drafting documents, they're not as good. These models are designed to find, logical solutions and to sort through a problem. So you can actually ask, once again, I'm going to say this a lot of times, if you're not sure what to use, do you need a thinking model? If you open up your whatever AI program you're happening to use, and you were to say, here, this is the problem I'm trying to solve. Should I turn thinking on or not use a thinking model? It will actually give you the answer and say, yes, that would be good, or no, it wouldn't be good. And I'm going to say this a lot of times. A lot of the times, the best person to ask is AI, whether you need a large model, whether a smaller model will use. If you explain your task, ask it, it will tell you the best tool for that task. So don't just use a reasoning model because you think they're the best. They're not an upgrade, they're just different types of models. The next thing I want to talk about are the limitations. We all talk about how good AI is, all of these different things it can do, but there are a lot of limitations that models have. And the first one is knowledge cutoffs. So when we talked about training models before, basically a company will set up their large data center, they've got a new model, they will let it loose, it will start scraping data from the internet, crawling around, reading everything. But that training data ends on a specific date. And sometimes it can be up to a year or 9 months before they release the model. So you have to be aware of knowledge cutoffs. If you're looking for something very recent, AI is the wrong tool to use. If you're looking for something that maybe happened more than a year ago, that's fine. But just be aware of that. If you're looking for something current events, something very time sensitive that happened recently, AI is not the right tool to use. And particularly with the older models, often they will keep an older model available when a newer model comes out. For example, with the Claude models or with the ChatGPT models, 5 is the latest one with ChatGPT, but you can still use 4 if you wanted to. That will have an even earlier knowledge cutoff. That might be 2 years ago. So just always be aware of that knowledge cutoff. The second thing I'm sure you've all heard is about hallucinations. So these models can hallucinate. They can give you a response with text that is not correct. So remember we talked about text generation models are creating statistically likely responses based on their training patterns. And they're good for, obviously, writing sort of scientific things. They're good for writing papers, but they're also good for writing creative stories and things like that. They're generating the next most likely word based upon all of these patterns that they've learned in training. So it's not like they're retrieving information from a library database or from some sort of library you use when you search, scientific literature and things like that. They are generating text. And they will present these fabrications confidently. Okay, so you have to be aware that anything that you are doing with AI might be incorrect. Okay, so you can use this as a starting point, but always verify anything that you get out of AI. And so this can be particularly dangerous in academic contexts because they can make up citations, they will be confident, and you just have to be very careful and always verify anything that you are used to. And this is particularly unsettling because we're used to being able to search a library, read things, and be fairly confident that, if it's in a paper or something, we have to verify it, but that it is correct. But just always be aware that they can hallucinate. So we talked about context windows before when we talked about tokens. So each model has a context window. Now, if I come back to OpenRouter, just to give you an overview, OpenRouter is a website you can go to, and you don't pay a subscription, you pay some money and you buy some credit. And that credit is converted into if you don't use it for a month, it doesn't get used. And depending upon what model you use, we've talked about here. Let me just sort of zoom in here so you can see this a bit better about the cost. So, if I used 1 million input tokens on this, it would cost me $3 of my credit. And if we have a look here at all of the different models, you can see there are 574 different models we can use. They will have, all of the GPT ones, whether it's, all of the OpenAI ones, ChatGPT, they'll have all of the Google ones. They will have, things if you're looking for Chinese models like DeepSeek and things, they'll all be on here. You can have a look at the rankings to see what are the most popular. But underneath them all, you will see this context window. Okay, so this is something else that's very important when you're considering what model to use. Smaller models have a smaller context window. Larger models have a big context window. Some of them now, if we look at the latest ones like Sonnet, might have 1 million tokens as their context window. So that's the model's working memory. Okay, so it's becoming less of a problem, and it's probably not a problem if you're using larger models now. This was more of a problem maybe a year or two ago, when even the flagship models had a smaller context window. But if you are going to upload a whole textbook or a whole study guide for maybe you teaching at university and you want to, format your study guide, if that study guide or that textbook is larger than the model's context window, it won't be able to read it all. The other thing is maybe you've used chat before and you've had a long conversation and you realize that it's forgotten things at the start of the conversation. That's because models don't remember. Okay, so if I'm having a conversation with a model, every time I send something to that model, I'm sending that whole conversation. So the first thing that I type into the chat goes, and then a response comes back. Then I write something, so my first part and its response, and the next thing I write goes back to the model. So when you have maybe, you've typed 30 different things and the model's responded 30 different times, those 60 individual bits of the conversation are going backwards and forwards to the model every time. So as that conversation grows in length, if that falls outside the context window, it will not read those first conversations. So every new message that you send, the entire conversation is reprocessed from the beginning. So if you're using a smaller model, that's why they can forget. Now, once again, we're talking about energy consumption. The bigger the context window, the more energy it is going to use to process that conversation. So if you are having a conversation with a large language model and you want to start talking about something different, start a new conversation. That's good for energy, but also it's better for the result that you'll get, the response you'll get from the model. Because if you change conversation sort of mid-tone, it can still read that first part of the conversation and it can think those two conversations are part of the same conversation and it can get a little bit confused. So always start fresh conversations or fresh chats for new topics. Really good for energy consumption, but also you'll get better responses. So just remember that when you're looking at doing something that requires, sending a whole document backwards and forwards to a model, if you're doing something with a whole textbook or a large textbook chapter, just make sure that the model's context window can handle it. Another limitation that we'll talk about with models is what models are capable of. So you've probably all seen in some of the newer models, they're capable of producing images. Maybe you can attach images to a conversation or video or audio, but that's only available on specific models. So if you do have to do something where you're sending spreadsheets or images, just make sure that the model can handle those. Now, this isn't such a problem once again now with the new flagship models, but if you are using some of the smaller models, maybe they're only trained for chat, maybe they can't handle images, maybe they can't handle audio. So just check what the capabilities of the model are when you have a specific task, if you are sending anything backwards and forwards other than text. So they're all trained on text. Obviously, there are image specific ones to generate images or videos, but as a general rule, they're all trained on text if you're using anything with chat, but only some of them will be able to handle images or audio or video, and some will be better at those things than others. So check the documentation for the model and what it excels at before you start doing anything with beyond just text. You'll see at the very end, I've gone through this quite quickly. Are there any questions that you want me to, because I'm trying to cover this quite quickly so we can get on to writing prompts and finish up within the time frame that we are allowed. Are there any questions so far about anything we've talked about?
Alex, I just let the attendees know I put the link to Open Router in the chat as well. And I have a quick question. So why do you still have a subscription to Claude when you also use Open Router? What is the difference?
So all of the models that are available in Claude, I could use in Open Router. But when I write code, Claude is the best. Claude is a company called Anthropic. So there's three big players in AI. You've got Anthropic, you've got Google, and then you've got OpenAI, that's ChatGPT. And Claude excels for coding. It's very, very good for coding. And with a subscription for Claude, I can plug it into my IDE when I'm writing code, and it allows higher, like if I'm doing something that's very token intensive, it can actually be cheaper for me to have a subscription for Claude when I'm doing programming, as opposed to just paying for the tokens. So the Anthropic are my favorite models. I'll come back to that. I just want to quickly just point out one thing here. I do have a model selection framework here for you to have a look at. Things that you should consider, whether you're assessing your task complexity, evaluate your content length, required capabilities, accuracy, importance. So you can have a look at this. But as a general rule, this is a personal thing. I like the Anthropic models for coding, but I also like for writing. I use them, just recently wrote a unit on prompt engineering for university. And I wrote the whole thing using AI with a whole lot of very complex prompts. And the one that I used for that was a Anthropic model, Sonnet 4.5. So ChatGPT and the Google models are good at other things, but I find for coding and also for writing things like content for my units, the Claude models excel. And that seems to be quite a common thing online. But I have this subscription primarily for coding. I have a subscription for this that costs, it's a pro subscription, and it costs, I don't know, 170 US dollars a month. So if I'm doing programming 8 hours a day for a whole week, which is a very token intensive thing, it's cheaper for me to have this subscription.
Thanks,
These
Alex.
models,
And Carl, yeah.
yep.
Carla also has a question in the chat. You've mentioned checking documentation. Is this available through Open Router? I guess,
No,
that comes back to, yeah.
Open Router just is a place where you can play around with different models. Maybe you can have a look at the rankings of models to see what people are using them for. So, what's the most common one? This is one of the ones I was talking about before. Number two in technology, programming, science, marketing. There are lots of different categories. So we could have a look at academia. What are the most popular that week? But it's very much just an integrated place. I won't go into too many details because it'll get a little bit complex, but it uses all of these companies have a chat interface, whether it's ChatGPT or Google Gemini, or all of them will have a chat interface, but they also make their models available through an API, which allows other people to use them. So if you use a chatbot on a website, it's not communicating with one of these models through this chat interface. It's communicating directly with the model through a programming API. So Open Router just communicates with all of these models directly through a programming API. Now, if you do have a very specific model that you love and you use all the time, maybe it is better to get a subscription if it works out cheaper that way. But if you do want to play around with lots of different models or have a look at all the different models out there, this is a very good place to go. As I said, you can buy, $10 or $20 worth of credit, and it will last as long as as it takes to use it all up. So if you do hear about a new model coming out, or maybe you want to try one of the new Chinese models, there's some very good models coming out of China. They will all be on here. Whereas if I get a subscription to Claude, I'm limited to only using Claude's models. If I get a subscription to ChatGPT, I'm limited to only using those models. Now, just depending upon what you use them for, if you are just using it to, format some documents, write some emails, check a few things, and you don't really care about being able to access, 500 different models, maybe you're better getting a subscription. Every use case is different, but I like this because I can just buy some credit, use it as I need, and I can try out all of the different models. In regards to where the documentation is, you probably more likely find that on the actual site of the company offering that model. So for example, Claude will have some documentation somewhere on their site. If I was to look up Claude documentation or ChatGPT documentation, it will explain all of their models, how they've been trained, what they're good for, and all of that sort of thing. So you might need to go to the actual website of the company who created that model. And it will tell you if you are using OpenRouter, for example. If we were to look at Gemini, that's by Google. If we were to look at, Claude, that's by Anthropic. So we could go to their site and actually, read their documentation. This will give you some indication, though. It will tell you, a bit about it. So we could see that, Opus is their top model. And if we were to have a look at that, it will tell you some things about it, give you a good overview of it. Here, multimodal capabilities, what it's sort of designed for. If we were to look at one of the smaller models here, like their Haiku one or one of their older ones, once again, it will give you some information about it, but there would be more information on Anthropic's actual website. So I know this is probably maybe a little bit overwhelming. What you really just need to consider is the size of the model, smaller model, quicker, less environmental impact. Play around with them. You don't need to try all of the models in here. You'll quickly work out whether if you like the OpenAI ChatGPT ones better, or the Claude ones, or the Google ones. Those are the three that most people will be using, unless they're in China, in which case they will be using some slightly different ones. So just to give you a quick overview, as I mentioned with Claude, you've got Sonnet is a very good one, and Haiku. When it comes to OpenAI, if we look in OpenRouter, if I look at OpenAI, their flagship is 5.1, and you can see, as I mentioned, they'll have quite a lot. These are more for images. GPT Codex, that's for programming. And then you'll see when they've got mini, they're the small models. And if we were to look at Google, Google, Gemini is there. Let me just go there for a second. Google. Nano Banana, that's their new image generation one, but the Gemini Pro is their flagship model, but their Flash usually their smaller models. So you want to use the one sort of like the latest model, but choose whether you want to use a large model or a small model. And you can, between Google, OpenAI, and Anthropic, that's Claude, those are the three big players in the market. You'll find 95% of people will be using one of those flavors. Okay, so I would have to do a little bit of research into that, Carla. So Carla's just asked, she does a lot of work in the Pacific with different languages, find out which models are good at not English languages. Generally, the flagship ones are good at non-English languages. Obviously, if you're in China, the Chinese models are good with Mandarin, but most of them have been trained on English because that's the vast majority of the internet. If you want to send me an email, I can do a little bit of research for you into that because, to be honest, it's not something I can't answer that off the top of my head because I'm not often looking at non-English languages. But I'm happy to do some research for you if you like.
Thanks, Alex. I'll contact you after.
No problems. So maybe now you understand why I've talked about models. As we mentioned, environmental impact, that's the main thing to take away. This is going to become a coming problem. This massive data center growth, massive, energy consumption that these are going to use, the water, all of the e-waste. So just keep that into consideration. If you do have a subscription to something, using GPT 5.1 for everything is not, the right thing. Maybe it's not the best model to use, but also consider the planet when we are using these things, because if you can, use the right tool for the job, you'll be saving yourself a bit of time and also doing the planet a favor. So we'll move on to, because we've nearly covered half the time, onto prompt engineering. Now, prompt engineering. Okay, so prompt engineering is the practice of designing clear, specific instructions to get useful, accurate responses from AI models. I'm sure you've all come to a model and tried to put something into it and you haven't got what you want out of it. Now, I really want to stress this. Most people think that you need to be an AI expert to be good at using AI. Now, if you are working for one of these big tech companies designing these models and training these models, yes, you need to be an AI expert. To use these models, you need to be an IT expert. To use these models, though, it has nothing to do with IT at all. You can learn to write prompts just as well as I write prompts, because it's all about explaining to the model in a format that it understands what you want in the response. Okay, so if you think about it, writing a brief for a colleague, the better your instructions, the better the results. And we're going to cover 5 key concepts, okay, that make prompts effective. And they're 5 easy to use concepts that will vastly improve the response you get from models. Now, as I mentioned, a lot of these pages will have this in-depth explanation. So what is prompt engineering? If you have a look at this in-depth explanation, you can see that this prompt here, if I was to copy this and I was to run this, it would explain what is prompt engineering in much, much greater detail. But if you look at all of these prompts on this website, you can see they're all written in a very particular way. Okay, so we're going to go through these concepts now, but you can have a look at them. They are all written in the same way. So if I come along to, go back to this reasoning model one, and we have a look at the in-depth explanation, once again, it's written in the same way. So by mastering these concepts, you can get AI to do pretty much whatever you want. Obviously you're going to have to edit what comes out, but you can get it to produce the result you want 90% of the way there. And there are more advanced concepts beyond this that if you learn, you can get it to format just about any way you want. You can get it to use different reasoning approaches, all sorts of things, but it all comes down to how we write this prompt. So the second thing I want you to just, while you're listening to me talk about these, you don't need to master these either. All you need to do is understand them, because these prompts here, I didn't actually write. I got AI to write them. If you understand these concepts, you know what information to give a chat to get it to write a prompt for you that then you can run to get the result you want. And what I mean by that is, this is something we call meta prompting. So this is our goal. We don't need to become a prompt engineering expert. We just want to understand these principles well enough to collaborate with AI, and the AI itself will help you write prompts. So when I write prompts, I write them in 2 steps. Okay, so let's say I want to write a chapter for a study guide. The first thing I need to do is write a prompt to generate some of the content, and then I'll write more prompts to generate activities or to format it or to write examples, all of those sort of things. But I don't start by writing the prompt. What I do is, it's a 2-stage process. I sit down with chat and I explain to AI. I tell it I need it help writing a prompt, and I explain what I'm trying to do. I get it to write the right prompt for me, which I then open another chat window and run, and that gives me the response that I want. So once you understand these concepts, you know what information to give AI for it to help you write the prompt that you want, that you're going to run, so to get the result that you want. So let's just go through them and I'll show you what I mean. Okay, so 5 core concepts. Establishing AI role and expertise. That's telling the AI who it should be. Then we're going to specify domain knowledge and methodology, so what knowledge it should use. Because remember, AI has been trained on all of the publicly available information if you're using a large language model. So who should it be? What information should it use? Then we want to specify a communication style and tone. We want to tell it how to communicate in the response. Then we want to set our constraints and requirements. So what parameters does it have to meet? What requirements do we have? What constraints do we have when we want in our response? And then we're going to just touch on this output format and structure because that's a huge topic, but that's how to organize and present the information in the response. So while we are doing this, I've got some examples here. So just a couple of prompts that we will use when we're talking about this. So one is for meeting documentation. So it's going to transform some rough notes into a professional meeting summary. The second is for some research communication. So it's going to transform a technical research abstract into a plain language summary for a general audience for like a media release. And the final one is to plan a workshop for a Python lecture. Okay, so the first concept that we want to understand is AI role and expertise. Now, all of these prompts that you look at, these 3 examples that we're going to use when we're talking about these concepts, but also before when I was showing you this in-depth explanation, have a look at how I start them all. You are a. Okay, that's the first thing you should be writing when you start any prompt. Okay, so let me come back to this concept, talk about role and expertise. So establishing AI and role and expertise, role specification, it tells the AI what expert perspective to adopt. Okay, so it identifies the specific skills or capabilities to emphasize. And as we mentioned, they're trained on vast amounts of data. So who should the AI be when it's giving you a response? Okay, should it be an engineer? Should it be a doctor? Should it be a scientist? And if it is a scientist, what type of scientist? So if we have a look at this in practice, okay, we say something like this: you are a, whoever it should be, with expertise in. Okay, so you're a data analyst, specialized in statistical modeling and visualization. You're a curriculum developer with experience in online learning design. Okay, so this is how we start all of our conversations. And remember, we can get AI to do this for us, and we will talk a little bit more about that. That's the whole goal of this. So for example, if I was to be looking for a prompt, if I'm writing a study guide, I might say something like, I'm an academic, I am teaching a unit in Python programming, my students are, this is their first programming unit, they're in their first year of university, they have never done any programming courses before. So it will then, when it writes the prompt for me, it will write this in such a way with the right role and expertise. And if we have a look at these examples, you can see that. You are a professional meeting coordinator and executive assistant skilled in creating clear and actionable meeting summaries for academic committees. We're telling it exactly what role it should play. Okay. And if you think about this, this is really important because, you know, if we have a look at this research communication, you're a professional science communication specialist with expertise in translating complex technical research into engaging content for general audiences. You excel at making specialized academic work accessible without oversimplifying or losing accuracy. We do this all the time ourselves. If you're talking to a colleague, imagine you are, I don't know, an industrial chemist, and you are talking to a colleague who's another industrial chemist. The language that you use is completely different than if you were explaining these concepts to your husband or wife at home, or to first-year university students, or to a journalist or something if you're writing a press release. Okay, so straight away we're telling the AI who it should be and what expertise it should have. This is the first thing that we want to do. The second thing we want to do is specify the domain and methodology. So the concept here covers, so this is building on the role and expertise, but it's adding field-specific context. Okay, so professional field to prioritize, any methodology that we want to use. You know, for an example, you know, a curriculum developer could draw on instructional design, adult learning theory, or subject-specific pedagogy. It just depends. You know, and we usually say this: apply best practices from whatever field, including whatever sort of methodology you want to use. So, you know, maybe I might say something like use approaches from Australian workplace health and safety, including risk assessment frameworks and compliance documentation. We have a look at the examples. I'm brushing over this quite quickly because we have a limited time, and you can come back and have a look at this. But this will make sense to you once you start looking at these examples and have a little bit more of a read. And remember, you can come to this concept if you want to know more about it. You can run this prompt and it will explain it, you know, pages, and will provide examples and all sorts of things. So these prompts that I've provided here will give you a lot more information. So if you want to know more about each of these concepts, run these prompts. But if we have a look at these examples here, so our meeting documentation. Apply best practices from professional administrative documentation and academic governance standards used in Australian universities. So we've told the AI who it should be, and now we are telling it sort of what methodology to use in its response. You know, if it's research communication, apply established science communication principles and media writing conventions for Australian research institutions. This here is, we're starting off our prompt here by telling the AI who it should be, exactly what we want, any methodology we want to use, that sort of thing. Okay, so that's the first thing that we always put in our prompts. Following that, and I haven't covered here, is we put our task. And you can use headings like this. AI really loves these sort of headings. Okay, so this is the task. Following who AI should be, that's what we usually say first, but then we will give it the task that we want. Okay, so coming back to research communication, the task that we want. All right, so that follows the role and expertise and the domain and methodology. All right, we specify our task. The next thing we want here is the style and tone. Okay, this is where we're telling it how the information should be presented, and sort of, you know, the tone, what emotional quality and attitude we should convey. All right, because obviously the same information, different audiences, we need a different approach. All right, so if you think about the three concepts we've covered: role and expertise, who to be; domain and methodology, what knowledge to use; style and tone, how it should communicate that knowledge. And if we have a look, you know, in practice, you know, use a professional, concise tone for executive reporting and decision making. Use a consultative, encouraging tone that balances expert guidance with student autonomy. Once again, if you think about this, you do this all the time in everyday life. When you're talking to a colleague in the hallway, it might be completely different than when you are presenting a paper at a you know, at a workshop, or if you are going to a conference, or if you're writing an email to a colleague compared to writing an email to a student. We do this all the time in our regular life, but AI doesn't know this, all right? It doesn't know what you want. You have to spell out everything. So if you're getting it to write an email, you want to tell it what tone to use. Do you want a professional tone? Do you want a friendly tone? This is really important because otherwise, you've all seen that text that you can just tell AI has written. That's because it just defaults to that sort of AI general tone if it hasn't been given a specific tone. So if we go and have a look at these examples, in the meeting documentation, I think I've probably the tone doesn't have to be style and tone anywhere in particular. We usually always put at the beginning, we put the AI role and expertise and the domain and methodology followed by the task. But then the other concepts can sort of get mixed in together because some of them overlap a little bit. But you can see down here for this particular one, meeting documentation, I've set a professional and objective using clear and concise language appropriate for academic governance documentation. If it's my research communication for a media release, you can see the tone down here, active voice where possible, use concrete examples and analogies where helpful for the style, tone, accessible and conversational, but still professional, enthusiastic about the research, without hype, respectful of the audience intelligence. So, this really matters because it's going to change its writing style dramatically based upon what we tell it here. And you can say that when you, as I mentioned, we're going to get AI to write these prompts for us. So when I'm telling AI, okay, I need a prompt, let's say I'm writing a study guide once again. If I tell it I'm writing a study guide, I tell it who my audience is, explain the audience, Python programming. I'm just using these examples because these are things I do. Python programming, first year university students, never programmed before. The style and tone that I want, I want it to be, helpful, but, and I don't really need to spell it out. It can pick up that style and tone quite well based upon the audience, but I can tell it, I want these students to be encouraged by the subject. I can tell it, to refer to the student as you. I could tell it, once again, use concrete examples, or if it's programming, use examples where you think appropriate, all of those sort of things, okay? And it will pick up that style and tone when it's writing the prompt for me. So the next principle, these are the two ones that are getting a little bit more in depth: constraints and requirements, and format and structure. Once again, I apologize that we're rushing over this quite quickly. You can come back and have a read about this, and once again, just run the prompts at the bottom of each of these concepts, and it will give you a lot more information on each concept. But constraints and requirements and format and structure, these are big ones. They really affect the output, the response that we're going to get. So constraints, they're limitations we're working within. Time, length, format, scope. How long do you want the document to be? If you're doing a PowerPoint presentation, how long is the talk? Some examples will really be useful here, which we'll have a look. But this is really important because without them, AI by its default optimizes for generic helpfulness rather than your specific needs. It doesn't understand your specific needs. It doesn't understand that, maybe you're a nurse and you're working in Australia and your constraints for the response are some particular Australian healthcare standard. It doesn't know that, you're a university, what sort of teaching methodology you use, things like that. And it's really important to specify your context because by default, it will generally use either US or UK because it's been trained on a lot of that data. So if you are at an Australian university, it's important to say that. If you are at a French university or wherever you happen to be, it's important to say that. So when we have a look at constraints and requirements, there are more than this, but the four basic ones: length constraints, word count, time-based, what specifications do you have, scope, what to include, what not to include, complexity, okay, technical depth, cognitive load, things like that, for your audience. Content constraints, professional boundaries, depending upon what field you work in, whether you're, an accountant or you're a doctor, there's always constraints that you're working in within your profession. There's always compliance requirements, things like that. There's always standards that you have to comply with. So you really need to spell those out for AI because they vary from country to country and profession to profession. So if we were to have a look at constraints in practice, these are some very simple ones, but constraints. If it's a tutorial, 50-minute tutorial time for students, complexity appropriate for, these are, Australian frameworks for Australian universities, but appropriate for AQF level 7 students. Scope, what it should focus on, content, things like that. Professional communication, length constraints, how many words. Its scope, what it should focus on. Okay, complexity, explain for non-technical stakeholders, things like that. Okay, training and education, you can see the same sort of thing. This is where we are telling it what our constraints in the response should be. Requirements, these are things that must include. Okay, so it must include these things in the response. And when we do constraints and requirements, AI really likes it, and it's much easier for you to write if you do them in bullet points. Spell out each one. Okay, so you can put a heading like must include, and you'll see that in the examples I'm going to show you in a minute. But spell out your requirements very clearly for it. Otherwise, it doesn't know if you don't tell it. And most of these things you don't even think about when you are communicating with a colleague or writing some sort of documentation, but AI doesn't know them. You have to spell it out. So you can see requirements must include, given some examples here. The complexity, must include data source for all statistics, risk assessment for each recommendation with these things, cost benefit analysis with these things, implementation timeline with these things. Be very, very specific. So you can see in these examples here, if it's meeting documentation, constraints, maximum 2 pages maximum, scope, content, requirements, highlight action items prominently, include 5 structural sections listed below. There's no right or wrong here. This is very specific on what you're doing. So it's quite hard here because every prompt that you're going to write will have different constraints and requirements. So remember here, the goal is just to understand this concept. And then when we're asking AI to write a prompt, and when we get AI to write our prompt, it's an iterative process. So as I said, we might start by saying, I am a lecturer, I'm teaching these first year students Python programming, never programmed before. Okay, I want a study guide. Okay, how long is it going to be? What should it cover? Okay, sort of what language should it use? Requirements. Okay, at the start of every chapter, I want 4 dot points highlighting, or sorry, at the start of every section, I want, 4 dot points highlighting that section. At the end of the chapter, I want an introduction, I want a conclusion, I want at the end of every section, I want, an activity or I want an example. This is where we're clearly spelling out what we need in our response. So you can tell AI that it will produce a prompt, you run it, it doesn't work, you can say, okay, it was too long, the response was, or it wasn't in the right, so you go backwards and forwards with AI, working this sort of thing out until it produces the right prompt for you that when you run, gives you the response that you want. If we have a look at sort of research communication, if we look at the constraints and requirements, so once again, this was for, a prompt to turn professional science into communication into engaging content for a general audience for a media release or something like that. So constraints, we've given it the length, complexity, written at a year 10 reading level, avoid academic vocabulary and jargon, No abbreviations or acronyms without explanation. Content, stay accurate to the actual research, no exaggeration or misrepresentation. Requirements, explain the research question in everyday language. Describe what the research investigates, explain why this matters. Make the research relevant to people's lives or concerns. Engaging opening that hooks reader interest. So you can see here, it's very clearly spelling out the constraints and the requirements that we want for this particular media release. Workshop planning, once again, constraints, duration, 2-hour workshop, setting, computer lab with approximately 25 students, audience and complexity, first year IT undergraduates. You can see it's the same thing. We're just spelling out very clearly what our constraints and requirements are for this particular, the response that we want for this particular prompt. And the last one is format and structure. Now, format and structure is, I could talk about format and structure all day, and this is something we're only going to brush on. But I would highly encourage you to have a look at this, because if you do understand format and structure, how to specify format and structure, you can get it to do pretty much any format and structure you want in your output. So let's have a look at the concept. So format is the structural container, how information is packaged. Structure is the logical organization, how the information flows. So together, if we can get this right, the response will be usable without reformatting. Okay, so there's lots of different formats that we might want to use. Professional, I think I've got these on the next page. Maybe have a look here, actually, okay. So, whether it's a professional email, meeting agenda, an executive brief, a lesson plan, procedure guide, AI can write tables, whether we want, priority-based Q&A, step-by-step. It can write all of these formats, and it can write formats in, much greater detail than here, but we need to spell it out. So, there's lots of things that you can get it to do, whether you want bullet points, numbered steps, checklists, pros and cons analysis, comparison tables, executive briefs. All of these things are possible. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, and I will show you some examples, and I might run the prompt at the end here, because that's got some really good information in. So when we use this in practice, okay, there's two ways we can specify format and structure. One is by specifying it like this. Format is a 2-page executive brief, with current situation and issues, proposed changes with rationale. You can have a look at that, or step-by-step procedure with these particular items, or decision support. Here we are telling it what format we want, but in point form. But once you get good at format and structure, what you can do is provide a format template in your prompt. And a format template might look like this, okay? So what I've done here, and there's lots of ways we can do this, but in my prompt, I'm going to say something like this: format each agenda item as, and you can see here, I have given it the actual format I want. Okay, so item, and in these brackets, it's going to fill it out. So let's say we were doing meeting notes. Each agenda item in the meeting, I would say something like, okay, item, and it's going to put the name in here for me. Discussion summary, key points and bullets. Decisions made, specific decisions. Action items, couple of checkboxes. Next steps. So I'm actually telling it in the prompt how I want things formatted. So that's getting a little bit more advanced, but I'll show you a few examples of this just to give you an idea of what I mean by this. When we have a look at these examples, you can see here, for this first one, once again, meeting documentation, I've told it how I wanted it. Format as a meeting summary with these things: a meeting overview with a date, time, attendees, purpose, key decisions made, discussion highlights, action items, next step. Okay, so that's me not giving it a template, but just explaining how I want it formatted. That's the first way you'll get started. Research communication, you can see I've said it, format it like this: an opening hook, 1 sentence, research question problem, 2 to 3 sentences, what was done, key findings, why it matters, workshop planning. Format it as a session overview, detailed timeline, teaching activities, practice exercises, assessment checkpoints, common pitfalls. So I haven't given it here an exact a template. This is the way we'd get started. But this might not give you exactly what you want. So if you do want to start playing around with templates, like we were talking about here, let me just come back here. I'm going to run this prompt for you, because I know in this prompt here, I did tell it to formats to cover. Let me just run this here. And while that runs, we'll talk about something else, because that might take a little bit to run. Let me just come here, paste that prompt in, and I will run that. Think for a minute. I just want to show you, because somewhere in this, it might be a little bit hard for you to read. I'll also run it here, maybe on here for a second. Chat. Let's add it here. Let's do it in Sonnet. Might be easier to read here. Oh, went wrong there. Okay. So you can see if you run this, it's going to obviously, like I mentioned, on each of these pages, if you run the prompt, it will give you information in far greater detail about that page. And just the reason I'm running this is because somewhere along here, once it explains it all and shows you a whole lot of examples, it will give you some templates. So we'll just come back to that. We'll let it run. So it'll end up being quite long, because I've told it to give lots of examples. So we'll come back to it in a minute once it's finished running. So those are the five key concepts you want to keep in mind when you write any prompt. And the final thing we're going to talk about is meta prompting. As I mentioned, the whole goal is just to understand these concepts so we can explain to AI what we require. Okay, so this is called meta prompting, using AI to help you create better prompts. Okay, so you understand what you want to do. You understand your field, your audience, the requirements and constraints you have. But AI is an expert at prompting. AI has, one, it works with prompts, but also it has, when it scraped a whole lot of data, has looked at thousands of examples of prompts. Okay, so the process that you have when you are getting AI to write a prompt for you is you're going to describe your task. AI is going to write a prompt for you. You're going to open up a new chat, run that prompt. Then if it doesn't give you what you want, you can say, okay, that was good. Maybe you even paste the output of the prompt in and say, that was good, but it was too long. Or you can see below in the response that you gave me, it went into too much detail here, or it wasn't formatted like that. Or maybe you want a particular format and you already have an example that you upload. So you can iterate with AI to get it to write a really good prompt, and then that prompt you can run. So as an example, as I said, this is just a very quick example. I might have a conversation with AI and I might say, so again, I'm teaching first year Python. This is their first programming course. I need to create a lesson plan for a 2-hour workshop covering variables. Can you help me write a prompt that will generate an effective lesson plan? AI might say, yep, I can need to clarify it, might ask some questions, or I might even at the end of this first bit say, ask any questions that you need to write a good prompt for me. AI will ask the questions it has. I will answer those questions, and it will generate a nice prompt for me. Then what I will do is open up a new window. I will run that prompt. It might not be quite right, because it'll often take a few goes. So then I might come back and say, I did that, but it went into too much detail here. Or I might even copy the output of that prompt and paste it into my chat and say, look, this was the output. You can see here that it's got too many examples, or it hasn't used headings effectively, or, I'd rather this be in bullet points, and you just refine with it. So you're going to have two chat windows, one where you're iterating this prompt, the second one where you run it. Does it give you the desired output? No, go back to the first one, talk to AI a bit more, get it to refine that prompt. If you play around with this, you will, and we can try this if you want. So let me just see if this is finished running here. This one was where we were talking about the output format and structure. You can see here, I'm giving it an example of an email that I want. Let me just find one here. Business meeting. Sorry, just looking for something here. So you can see here, if I wanted to maybe do course advisory committee needs an agenda, I might actually give it a sample of one that it's previously done and explain how I want it done. Or I might, let me just come down to where it's, find something here. I suggest maybe you run this. I just wanted to see if it'll, somewhere in here, it should have given us some examples of, I'm just looking for a simple one and still working on it. So let's just go back to this, do a little bit of meta prompting. So what I mean by meta prompting, let me open a new chat. And let's say I start off with this. This is how I would do my prompting when I want it to do a prompt. So let's say I add a model here. And I will work with Haiku because it's a smaller one. It'll be quite quick. So I might say something like that. Okay, teaching a first year Python in Bachelor of IT. This is one we talked about. Can you help me write a prompt? Ask me any questions you have to write this prompt. Okay, so I will run this. Okay, so you can see it's asked a bunch of questions. Okay, student background, do they have any programming experience? So I might say, student background, no experience, format size, class format size. So I would go through this one at a time and answer its questions. I'll just say lecture, teaching style, lots of code examples. What do I want? Okay. Say lots of examples, technical scope, Python version. Just say version. Just quickly answer these questions and you'll see what I mean. So, okay, so I'll say 3.12, depth of variables. I'll say all of above, and we'll just leave it run here. So I'll run that. Okay, so you can see now it's writing a prompt for me. Okay, so I might come here and I'm going to copy this prompt, and then I'll open up a new chat window. Once again, I'll just add Haiku. It's just a small model that's nice and quick. And I'll paste that prompt in and I will run it. Okay, so it's writing this for me. So it's creating the lesson plan. Now, maybe I'm not happy with this lesson plan. So maybe there's two things I can go. So I've got my two chats here. This is the one that's creating the prompt. This is where I'm running the prompt. So now I might go through this and say, okay, you know, you haven't done this, or I might even copy all of this in to this chat here and say, okay, you know, I want the following changes, you know, and then I'll put them in point form like this, list the changes I want, and get it to rewrite that prompt. And then I'll come here and run it and have a look at the output. And then sometimes I might even copy the output. I might, you know, copy all of this output here and come back and say something like, you know, I might list the changes I want, or I might say something to it like the output of the prompt is below. I want, you know, and spell it out so I can actually see what I want to change, and I'll actually paste the whole output in there. So basically what you're doing here, once you understand these principles, is you're going to have two chat windows open, one that's helping you write a prompt, the second one where you run it. And you keep refining it with AI. And as you can see, it knows the principles. So when it's created this prompt for me, if we have a look at this prompt, let me just get rid of all of this. You can see, once again, it started with setting the role and expertise. It's given the context. It's listing the constraints and requirements here. It's listing the format, the output format. So you can see it understands these principles. We just need to provide it with enough information to write this prompt for us. So that's what I mean when I talk about understanding these principles here. You don't need to be able to write it yourself. You know, you're not going to write these massive prompts yourself, and you can end up writing them pages and pages long just by going backwards and forwards, refining with AI. So long as you understand the principles and you understand, you know, who your audience is, and you explain that to AI, what role it should take, you understand any methodology you want to use, how you want it to communicate, the constraints and requirements you have, and the output format and structure. So long as you understand those things, then in theory, you can work with AI and it understands them as well. So it will create prompts for you, but then you just need to go backwards and forwards and refine with it. Have anyone got any particular questions about this? I know I'm rushing over this quite quickly, but if I was to write a unit on this, we would cover this over a few weeks. So I'm covering a lot of things here to give you a very quick overview of all of the things that you need to know. Does anyone have any particular questions about what we've talked about?
Hi, Alex. Can you
And
hear
not-
me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Hi, this is Amy here. Thank you very much for this really instructive lesson. I sort of came in a bit late and I got distracted because of a student knocking on my door. But I was wondering, do you have a link to the slides that you are sharing? I seem to recall you mentioning a link,
Yeah, it's
but
on
I
all
can't
on a
find it.
website here. So if you go to ai-workshop.it.scu.edu.au.
Okay, super. Thank
Do
you
you
very
mind,
much.
Alex? Can you put it in the chat, Alex? That
Yep,
might be
I'll put it in
helpful
the
if you
chat.
put the. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you.
So this website will be up, and if you want me to refine anything or add anything, I'm more than happy to do so. So let me just quickly go back here. I just want to see if it's giving me better illustration prompt. I should have actually done something. What I might do is actually post some examples of some format templates. But remember, if you want a particular format, if you've got a format already to go, and I'm just keen because 3:30 is when I'm scheduled to finish talking. So if you have a particular format, when you are writing this prompt here, so I go back to this, I'm teaching, first year Python in Bachelor of IT, this is the first programming unit. And I'd probably explain it. This is just a very simple example. I'd explain it a bit more, Australian university, always specify what country you're in. It's an Australian university. They're doing a Bachelor of IT, first programming course. If I have a particular format that I've already done, I would attach that to this prompt. So I would say, I've attached a document. This is the format I want. The way AI works is with something called Markdown. So if you understand, Markdown is very simple to understand. It's a sort of very simple formatting language. You can post formats in Markdown. So I could either upload something that I've already got, whether it's maybe a PDF, or I could copy and paste something in here that's in the right format in Markdown, and it will follow that format exactly. So I do that, for example, with I have prompts, for example, that will write activities for my programming courses, and they always follow the same format. So explain the concept, explain the programming activity, put out the output that would that code would have, and then explain the output, and it will follow that format every single time. So I should have actually got something ready for that, and I just that put out quite a lot of stuff that I don't want to trawl through for 2 minutes while you sort of sit there waiting for me to give it to you something. So, but if you do have something in the right format, when you are getting it to help you write the prompt, attach that or put that in the prompt, and just iterate backwards and forwards. Run that prompt. Just check that it gives you what you want. If it doesn't, come back and rerun it. And there'll be lots of examples online if you were to have a look for, how do I use format templates in prompting. This is just something that I want to stress, that you can get it to any format you want. So, if I was to say something like very simple here, let me just open up one more chat. This is the last thing I'll show you because we're almost done here. Let me just put a new chat in here. Show me some example templates of how to specify. Check here. What is it? Structure in a prompt. So you can see it's given a few simple examples, so, format your output. If I was to put this in a prompt, this is the exact format the response would be in. This is a heading, points, action items, first item, second item, third item, a table. This is what I said, Markdown. It's a very simple way to specify format in prompts. So if I was to say, present the comparison in a table format like this, with feature, option A, B, C, with cost, performance, ease of use, it would put out this every time I run the prompt. Or if it's a step-by-step and I was to put this, format as a number tutorial, and I actually give it a format like this, that's the way the format would come out every time. So just remember that when you are playing around with format, as we talked about just in these examples here, you can specify just how you want it, sort of like this, and let it sort of fit that. But if you play around with it and you upload something, or it won't take you too long to learn how to specify the output format and structure in a prompt. Then every time you run that prompt, you'll get the exact same format and structure. So that's very helpful if there's something a prompt that you run every month or every week, or for, for me, for tutorial classes, I want the same format and structure for all of my activities. So yeah, look, we'll leave it there because it's 3:30 and that's when it was specified that I would stop talking. So those are the simple, there are, as I mentioned, once you master these, there are more advanced concepts. But if you just stick to this, role and expertise, domain and methodology, style and tone, constraints and requirements, and format and structure, you will be able to get much better results out of any prompt that you write. And if you pair that with the right model, like we talked about in the first half of this talk, you are a long way to, well on the path to being able to get AI to do pretty much 90% of what you need, and you'll have to do very little editing of the response. So let me have a quick read here of some things.
Alex, I had to transfer to my phone. My computer crashed, but so apologies. But Carla, thank
Yeah, I
you.
just see a couple of questions here. So long prompt, like your example, can it be done as smaller or larger? That is fine, because remember when we talked about the context window, even on a small model, if I go to OpenRouter and I have a look at the models, like the model I was just using there, Haiku, which is a fairly small model, it's still got a 200,000 K, so 200,000 token context window. Even the very small models, like maybe the small llama ones, for example, they're still all going to have, over 100,000 context window. The difference between small and large models comes down to, if I was going to edit a whole study guide, I'd have to, and maybe it's 100,000 words, I might have to use a larger model. The model size comes down to more what you're trying to get it to do. Okay, so complex reasoning, chain of thought, things like that. If you're getting it just to format a study guide, you can use one of the smaller models. They all have a big enough context window for any of these prompts that I've given you. You'll be able to run those in a small model or a large model. But when we talk about small and large models, it more comes down to, if I go to the model selection framework, is it a simple routine task, or is it complex reasoning and analysis, or is it multi-step logic problems? Things like that. Okay, so it's more about, am I getting it to solve an advanced programming problem or do some advanced mathematical analysis, or am I just getting it to format a study guide chapter? Okay, that's where small and large models, because the large models have much more parameters, many more parameters, so they are capable of doing far more in-depth reasoning or, more advanced mathematics, things like that. So it's not so much about the size of the prompt or the size of the response. That does play into, the context window. But for most things, even the small models these days will have a big enough context window for a large prompt or a large response. It's more about what task you are doing. Does that make sense, Amanda? And if it doesn't, just let me know. And Carla, okay, super helpful. Copilot. Okay. So the reason a lot of universities, and our university is similar, use Copilot, two reasons. One, Copilot can integrate with the whole Microsoft environment. Okay, so if you're using, SharePoint and they're using Word and, Teams and Outlook for email, Copilot will integrate with those things. So it works very well with other Microsoft products. So for example, I could, ask, if I can't find a particular email or something that Anya posted on SharePoint or some email she sent me, I could ask Copilot and it would because it trains the model. On top of the model, it also has access to all of the data in your university organization's Microsoft environment. The second reason is when they sign an agreement with a particular institution, they agree not to use any of that data for their training. Okay, so when it comes down to using non-Copilot models, if you pay for something like ChatGPT or Claude, in the settings somewhere, and I'm not sure where it would be in Claude, if you are paying for it, there will be somewhere that you can tick to turn off, make sure don't use any of my data for training. If you're using the free version, for example, if I just go to, all of them will offer something for free. And if I go to ChatGPT, for example, and I don't log in, and I just use the free version, or even if I do log in but don't sign up and I just use the free version, then yes, it is using anything you put in there for training. So you do have to be careful with that. Now, my general rule is, so I, for example, have a complex program that runs a whole bunch of prompts that marks all of my programming assignments, but I'll make sure they're anonymized before I do that. I don't upload anything with student names or student IDs, things like that. I would be very careful. I would not use a free version of anything that I'm not paying for. On anything that is proprietary, that is mine, if it's some research you're doing, things like that, I would make sure that I check that, their training policy. But in all of them, when you do pay for any of these services, I'm not sure in OpenRouter where that would be or whether that's an option, but I do know that in ChatGPT, if you have a paid version, and in Claude, if you have a paid version, there is an option in the settings that says do not use any of my anything I input or my conversations for training. But the free ones will use your data for training and anything you do with them for training. So, I guess if you're working at a university, anything that is, the university's intellectual property, things like that, I would be, I would be checking that sort of thing before. That is something that you have to consider. One of the problems that these companies have is they have actually run out of data to train their models with. So these large models now have consumed every bit of publicly available information on the internet. And they're going through now, I mean, you probably read about all the court cases from the New York Times and other places because they've read all of their newspapers. OpenAI a few years ago they created a product and they actually sell it now, and it's a speech to text product. So it can convert, it's a thing that they use for transcribing meetings. The reason that they originally developed that product was because they ran out of data on the internet to train with. So what they did was they wrote this product that would convert speech into text, so that then they could start scraping YouTube, and then they could use all of those conversations. Because remember, they train, like we talked about at the beginning, they train on text. So they would scrape YouTube, they would convert all of the YouTube videos into text, and then they would train their models on that text. They're looking for more and more information, anything they can find to feed into these models. So paid models, you have the option to turn off that. But I could 99.9% guarantee that anything I put into ChatGPT now when I'm not logged in will definitely be used for training.
Thank you so much, Alex. I'm also very mindful of your time.
I've got nothing else on this afternoon, so I'm happy to hang around as long as people have got questions. I was just running through that because it said 3:30 when I finished talking, and that was when we were going to have Q&A, so that's why I was rushing to get done by then. Otherwise, I could have talked all day about these different things, and anyway.
Are there any more questions from the audience? I have to say, Alex, I listened to your talk for the second time and I learned again so many things I didn't pick up on the first one. So it's really lovely that we can record this. We will put this on the Futures Coast website so people can access it and also make the link to your website available. I think that's a wonderful resource, and really thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah, a couple of quick things. My email is up here. So anybody who got any questions, you feel free to email me. If you want something else added to this site, feel free to let me know, and I'm happy to add additional things. Just remember that all of these pages, when we were talking about these things, they do have expanded points, which, I just rushed over this because I had a lot to get through, but you can read the expanded points, which will have a lot more information. And then a lot of these pages, as I mentioned, will have a nice big prompt that you can run. And it is designed for this one, we're on reasoning models. So if you run this prompt, you'll notice it follows the format that we talked about, but it would cover reasoning models in a massive amount of detail and explain, in pages all about them. So, you can go through and find more information on just about every slide. But if there's anything on here that you feel missing, or you want expanded on, or you want to talk to me about anything, or you need help with anything to do with prompt engineering, or there's anything you want to talk about, I can talk about this stuff all day. So feel free to contact me, and I'm more than happy to help. I'm also more than happy to I'll hang around for a little bit. I don't know if you want to turn recording off, but I'm more than happy to hang around for a little bit if anyone wants to have a chat further.
Thanks, Alex. Are there any questions from the participants? Otherwise, Shifang, we may stop the recording and can ask any further questions if you have.